second bit of dirty laundry, one of my personal favorites, is the Inquisition. Now, I have to lay down a couple of principles here. Every society believes that there are forms of thought or speech which are inimical to that society and which must be controlled or punished. Oh, us? Try saying the N-word in public. Go ahead. You know what that comedian Kramer got for his money. Try denying the Holocaust in Europe. You go to jail. Now, don't get me wrong. I had relatives who died in the Holocaust. That's not my point at all. My point is, we only believe in freedom of speech when we're not concerned about the thing being discussed. We're only really tolerant when we don't care. Other than that, the more intensely we're interested in something, the less tolerant we are. And every society arrogates to itself the right to defend itself against what it considers to be a threat in terms of speech and thought. Anybody here ever hear the phrase hate speech? That is uttering heresy in this particular society. It's important to bear that in mind. I was making the same point in another lecture, and the fellow said to me, well, so you're admitting you guys are no better than anyone else. I said, no, I'm saying you're expecting us to be better than you are. You're holding us to a higher standard than you hold yourself. That's what I'm saying. And if you don't mind that, if you're okay with that, that's great, but admit it. So, bear that in mind, though. Now, the Inquisition is an interesting institution, especially because there were really three of them. The medieval Inquisition, which started in the 1200s for reasons I'll touch on shortly. The Spanish Inquisition, which no one ever expects. Don't know who'll get that, who will? That began in the 1400s. And then there was the Roman Inquisition, which starts in the 1500s. Each of these were allied institutions, but as you'll see, rather different. Now, we must remember one other important thing, and that is every society has a state church, an established religion, even when they pretend they don't. In the Soviet Union, it was Marxism. There is no God, and Lenin is his prophet. Well, that's what it came down to. Now, that philosophy, that dominating philosophy of that given society, does two important things. It gives legitimacy to the leadership, and it sets down the rules that everyone claims they play by. That is the civic role of a religion. And every society, including this one, has it. Ours is very ill-defined. You only really know when you've hit its strictures when you get smacked around for doing so. As I say, use hate speech, find out what happens to you. Now, having said that, in most of European history, as in most of the world, that religion was actually religious, with a stated set of doctrines. As you know, not just in the Islamic world today, but in the Buddhist world, by which I mean Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Burma, it's very difficult if you're not Buddhist. It's not impossible, not like some of the Muslim countries, but it's difficult. And in India, if you're not a Hindu, depending on where in India you are, in the cities it's very different. But if you're out in the countryside, it's difficult if you're not a Hindu. And so it goes. This is human nature. It's the way it always is. And I know Catholics are human too. Fine. Having said all of that, let's get historical. The Inquisition did not begin until the 13th century. Now you might ask why. There were heresies before then. Why didn't they see fit to fight them? Well, the answer is that most of those heresies were pretty easily defeated intellectually. And they didn't get a great deal of traction after the Arian heresy was over. So that changed in the 1200s. And what changed was the nature of the heresy. It came from the East in the wake of the Crusades. And yes, this is why the Inquisition comes afterwards, because it was one of the less pleasant byproducts of the Crusades. Has anyone here ever heard of Manichaeism? Well, that was it. Now, Manichaeism was an interesting religion because its major tenet was what is called dualism, which, to be a little oversimplifying and vulgar, and you'll understand, I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that I do a lot of oversimplification here. You don't have a choice when you're painting with a broad brush. Nevertheless, dualism tells us basically that there are two gods, two equal gods in the world, in the universe. One good, one evil. The evil one created flesh, and the good one's spirit. We, poor human beings that we are souls created by the good God, but trapped by the evil demiurge in this world of matter. And if someone says, wow, that sounds like Scientology. Nothing is new under the sun, ladies and gentlemen. So, the thing is that there were several, I don't know how you would say it, several results of this belief. The one is that human authority in church and state was bad. The church was evil and corrupt because it taught that the body was good. The state was evil and corrupt simply because it was appertained to the world. But there was more than that. Life itself, in the sense that we think of it, is an evil. Procreation, the transmission of life, is evil because you are trapping new souls in your trap. But at the same time, it was recognized that the body has urges. So, how do they handle that? You could do anything you liked, as long as it did not result in children. As long as it did not result in children, anything sexual was okay. So long as there were no children to come out of it. Because that would have meant that you would trap spirits in this prison of flesh. Meat puppets, as Tom Cruise calls them. Now, the important thing to bear in mind here, though, in addition to all this, and again, stop and imagine that you're any kind of authority on the outside listening to this stuff, looking in on this. You also, at the end of the day, are given one more interesting teaching, and that is that suicide is virtuous. Now, all of these things, as you can imagine, gave a little bit of pause to both the ecclesiastical and political folk of the day, because you don't want to pay taxes, because that's paying taxes to the evil one. You don't want to obey the secular authorities any more than the ecclesiastical ones. You obey your own authorities. And yes, they had their own hierarchy. But their hierarchy was a very interesting one. You see, I've told you they could do anything they wanted sexually. And that's kind of a weird etymology. It's a little bit vulgar, literally. The first place where they come into Europe is Bulgaria. So for a while they're called Bulgars. And that word gave birth to a verb in English and a verb in French. I will leave you to figure out what that verb was. I won't tell you, I'm too nice. But some of you caught it, some of you didn't. It's all right. The thing is that their priests were called perfecti. They were celibate, obviously, but I mean they were celibate. They were vegetarian. They were non-drinking. They were really real bores. But these perfecti, if you wanted to save your soul, you had to be one by the time you died. Now, for the vast majority of adherents, This wasn't going to work very well. Why? Because they didn't want to live like that. So most of them put off getting made perfecti until their deathbed. But wait a minute, what if you recovered? You were stuck with this vow. The consolamentum could rescue you. Pillow over the face, and off you go. So it was a common practice that if you did recover after having been made one of the perfecti, you would commit suicide or have it done to you. Anyway, they became, in other words, a terribly grim lot. And also, they had no problem taking the lives of those they opposed. And when, in the south of France, the Count of Toulouse began to favor them, partly as a counterweight to his enemies, they spread like wildfire in southern France, having come through Italy. And they were a formidable opposition. Why? Well, I'll tell you. Firstly, the clergy of that time in southern France were not very good. They were immoral. A lot of them had mistresses. A lot of them were ignorant. A lot of them were willfully ignorant. I know it's hard to believe that clergy could be willfully ignorant, but it does happen. They were just really the worst possible mess. And then up come the perfecti. And these perfecti, whatever else you say about them, they kept their rules. Now, the rest of them were doing all sorts of things, but not the perfecti. Another name for the group in southern France was the Cathars. And the third name for them were the Albigensians. The Albigenses. Now, to combat these guys, there arose a religious order, the Order of Preachers, led by a man called Dominic de Guzman. We know him better as Saint Dominic. And he trained his brothers, they were mendicants, which meant they were beggars. He trained them very carefully, very well, to be able to debate the perfecti, beat them at their own game. And they did very well with it, I must say. And all seemed, initially, like he might be able to defeat them the way heretics have been defeated in the past. These were a little bit different. And they started murdering the Dominicans. So that wasn't kosher. Worse yet, they were being sheltered by the Count of Toulouse. The long and the short of it was that a crusade was called against said count. The great Albigensian crusade. And it was terrible because it was a civil war. How many here know the bloodiest war in our history? How many can tell me? The Civil War. More Americans died fighting one another in that war than on all the rest of the world's battlefields combined. Nothing is as nasty as civil war. And that was what the Albigensian Crusade was. But when it was over and the Albigenses were militarily defeated, then there was the question of making sure that those who claimed that they had seen the light were sincere. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the beginning of the medieval Inquisition. Now, the medieval Inquisition was an interesting thing. It was a church court. Civil courts at this time were not very, how do I put this? Let's say they were kind of catch as catch can. They had trial by combat. You know, the innocent party will win every time. They had trial by, having you walk over hot coals and things like that to see whether or not you were innocent or guilty. There's a word for that, and I can't think of it. Well, trial by ordeal, yes, exactly. Trial by ordeal. They had all sorts of other little fun things like that. Well, the Inquisition was nothing like that. It had very, very definite ways of dealing with things. One of the most interesting to me was that you were never told who your accuser was, but you were asked to make a list of your 10 worst enemies. And if your accuser was one of them, you're out. That's it. No more. And if you didn't, you'd have a trial. Now, in the course of the trial, if you denied you held heresy, they'd try to prove that you did. One of two things would happen. They would or they wouldn't. If they did, well, then you would be given a punishment depending on whether or not you were repentant or claimed to be. And most of these things were penances like you're used to out of the confessional, only a little bit nastier. Bread and water for periods and so on, periods of imprisonment. But what about the recalcitrant? Those who absolutely refused to give way, who kept on with what they had. Well, remember what I said about the state authorities. How do you think the state felt about a religious sect that refused to accept the authority of the state over them? Not very well. And so, they would be handed over to the secular arms, it was said, and executed as traitors. Well, that was the medieval Inquisition. Now, what about the Spanish Inquisition? We go forward in time 200 years. You may remember, as I said earlier, that Spain was conquered by the Muslims. Anybody have any idea how long it took to liberate Spain?
700 years.
What's that?
700 years.
700 years. The Reconquista. And it was a bloody, inch by inch, step by step thing. It was not much fun. And by the time the Spanish got to Granada in 1492, they'd pretty much had enough of the whole Muslim thing. You know, they didn't appreciate it very much. So they soon encountered a problem. And that problem was that while the Moors of Spain were defeated, they had a lot of Moriscos who claimed to have converted. And they had another problem. The other problem, and I'm sorry to have to bring this up, but the Jews in Spain worked for the Muslims. We think of them as enemies now, but in those days and in that place, they worked as administrators and that sort of thing. And this, of course, had a very unfortunate result for them afterwards. Because what happens to those who collaborate with an occupying power when the occupying power is defeated? You generally lose your job. But here comes the trick question. Now I'll save it for a minute. So initially, the Jews and Muslims were not required to convert. But something else was happening at the same time. Remember in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottomans were swarming into the Balkans. And their ships, remember those Barbary pirates I told you about? They were going all through the Mediterranean. And there was a tremendous fear on the part of the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. You remember them. There was a great fear that the Ottomans would come back, attempt to retake Spain, and that the Muslim and Jewish populations would collaborate. But wait, there was more. There started to be anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim mob violence in Spain. Now, this was a twofold problem. One, it was illegal. But two, that kind of thing not only is unjust, it can really wreck your attempt to govern. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how to tell you this, but civil unrest and rioting is not a good way to keep your places quiet and safe. Those of you who remember the Hollywood riots, the LA riots rather, in '92, may recall that they were not a good time to walk safely down the street in large parts of the city. It's true. So, Ferdinand and Isabella were faced with a huge dilemma, and that is, what do we do with the Muslims and the Jews? The answer was, we asked them to convert, and if they won't, they can leave. And that's what happened. They were expelled, and a lot of the Muslims and Jews from Spain went to Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, and a lot of others went to Turkey, where they became a very, prominent part of the local scene. Anyone here know what Ladino is? The language? Spanish Jews. But where is it spoken today? Turkey and Greece, because that's where their ancestors went. And it bears the same relationship to Spanish that Yiddish does to German. So, when you hear a Sephardic Jew, that means Spanish. So think of Ladino and all that. So, that was the fear, and that was how it was dealt with. But what of the new Christians? Were they sincere? Well, some of them definitely were. Some of them were not. And some of them, we know of a certainty, plotted with Spain's enemies, like, you ready for this terrible word? The Netherlands. And worse yet, England. I know, it's a terrible thought. But really and truly, that was the origin of the Spanish Inquisition, was to deal with that question. But here's a factoid that you should keep in mind. First, here's the trick question. How many Jews were executed by the Spanish Inquisition? None. 0. Why? Because only Christians, only Catholics were under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. If you didn't convert, the Inquisition had nothing to say to you. If you did convert, that was another story. Now, here's where it gets peculiar. They had a very, very involved trial process. And my head for figures is very bad, but there's one factoid that sticks in my head. In the entire history of the Inquisition, from the 1490s to the 1810s in Spain, more shepherds in Aragon were handed over to the secular arm for bestiality than heretics were handed over. Now, that's one of those statistics, ladies and gentlemen, that leaves you very uncomfortable. I can never look at a lamb stew quite the same way. Victims. But at any rate, that is a true story. I'm sorry to tell you, it's pretty weird, but there it is. So that then was the Spanish Inquisition. Like the medieval Inquisition, it acted to defend the society and the time and the place of the day. That brings us to another thing to look at, and that is, we know, as I've said, that from the 1400s to the 1800s, the Spanish Inquisition dominated in Spain, right? What did Spain lack during that period that France, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Germany had? Now, they had no Inquisition. What did they have?
They had the Reformation.
Beyond that, they had civil wars. They had murderous, horrible, horrible civil wars. Germany in particular. The 30 Years' War alone. I mean, you would have to wait until the 20th century to see a conflict as miserable as the 30 Years' War. It was really, really horrible. If you wonder where the Enlightenment came out of, that's a big part of it, was that background. You had a man like John Locke looking at what had happened in England during his lifetime, what we call the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And this was not something that anybody wanted to go through again. Spain was spared all that. Now you may say, oh, well, wait a minute, but it was terrible for them, wasn't it? Well, here's where one of those funny little things comes into play. Let's say that was true. It was always easy to find English settlers to come to the New World. It was pulling teeth to get Spaniards to come here. Why is that? It's very simple. Spain, in those days, was a pleasanter place to live than England. It's that simple. I mean, it was the same with France, it was the same with Portugal, who all had their own methods of dealing with these things. The French had a terrible civil war with the Huguenot Wars. It just went on and on and on and on and on. And after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, it became very, very difficult to get Frenchmen to leave France. That was one of the big problems with Quebec, with Canada. It was always a difficult thing to get the French to leave France. Only the Huguenots did so in large numbers. Well, So much for the Inquisition. I should mention the Roman Inquisition. That was founded in the 1500s in the wake of the Council of Trent. And it was intended purely to prevent heretical things amongst the community of Catholic theologians. Under various names, it survives to this day as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And it does what it always did, which is to monitor the orthodoxy of Catholic theology. Now you can say, well, gee, why don't they allow freedom? To which my response is, for the same reason we don't allow hate speech. A society does not allow, and the Catholic Church is a society, like any other, they do not allow the very raison d'etre of the society to be attacked. They just don't. I mean, if you're going to say you're a Catholic priest, and you're going to write, and you're selling books on the basis of being a Catholic priest, and you're going to say that our Lord didn't resurrect from the dead and there's no Trinity, don't expect to get away with that. I mean, you're perfectly free to become something else. But you don't go trading as a Catholic theologian when you're not. We even have laws, mutatis mutandis, governing that here. It's called truth in advertising. You know? So if you're going to run around as a great Catholic theologian, that's nice, but you ought to be Catholic, I think. So much for the Inquisition. We're halfway through, ladies and gentlemen. We'll pick up the pace.